Good evening from Bangkok. My name is Roy Wadia. This is the latest edition of What's Changed, our ICPD 25 special panel talks. The focus this evening is on midwives, and I'm here with a very distinguished panel to talk about what's changed in the area of midwifery. It's a special that we're doing for the ICPD 25 commemoration, and it's just being taped about 5 days before the International Day of the Midwife. And so I'm going to turn to my panelists and ask them to say who they are and what they do. Caroline.
Hi, Caroline Homer, Professor of Midwifery and Co-Program Director, Maternal and Child Health at the Burnet Institute in Melbourne, Australia.
Catherine.
Yes, Roy, my name is Catherine, Breen, Kamkong, and I'm the Sexual and Reproductive Health and Rights Advisor for UNFPA in the Asia-Pacific Regional Office.
Sathya.
Sathya Doraiswamy, Chief of Health at the UNFPA Bangladesh Country Office.
And Rondi.
Rondi Anderson, Midwifery Specialist, UNFPA Bangladesh.
Thank you all for being here. It's been a very long day for them today. They've been at a workshop on doing roadmaps to end maternal mortality across Asia and the Pacific in the highest prevalence countries. So Caroline, it's been 25 years since the ICPD Programme of Action, and from your vast experience as a midwife, as a professor, as a policy advocate, what's changed?
So much has changed actually. 25 years is all the time that I've been a midwife, which seems like a long time. I think when I first started doing this sort of work, we didn't have a lot of evidence. So we knew in our heart that midwives and midwifery made a difference, but knowing in your heart isn't enough to make a big change. So over the last decade in particular, we now have an extraordinary amount of evidence showing the value, the contribution, the importance that midwives will make to the lives of mothers and babies. So particularly UNFPA have supported the State of the World Midwifery reports in 2011, 2014, and we have a new one next year. We've also delivered a large series, the Lancet series on midwifery, which for the first time pulled together all the evidence on midwifery for low, middle and high income countries. So I now feel we have a level of confidence around the value of midwives, the value of midwifery, and that makes an enormous difference in designing programs, in evaluating programs, and in bringing about change.
Catherine, you've been with the Population Fund now for a while, and you've of course been a midwife and public health advocate for the last many years, working in so many countries, in challenging circumstances. From your perspective, what's changed over the last 25 years?
Thanks, Roy. Yeah, I think what we've seen is that there is, first of all, if we talk about it, and since ICPD, we see that there is importance placed on women's health, and that midwifery is one of the vehicles to ensure that women have that right to health realised. I think that we've seen recognition of this, but nevertheless, and we've also seen that there's been a big decline in maternal mortality. This is something that 25 years ago wasn't on any agenda, it wasn't measured, it wasn't counted, but since ICPD put that on the agenda, we've actually seen that what is often a silent reality, we've put it to the forefront, and we've made countries count it and made it an important target and goal for countries. I think that one thing with midwifery, UNFPA really, since our inception, we have really pushed and advocated for the advancement and the recognition of midwifery as a profession. And we started, really supporting countries with midwifery associations. And we worked also on the regulation of midwifery. We also worked on education. But I'd say as we're moving on and where we are now, we're recognising also that midwives need to have an enabling environment that It's not fair to put a midwife by herself out in a health facility without the drugs and support that she needs, without the ability to, to refer a woman to receive further care. So we've recognised within UNFPA, and globally, that we need a strategy to really make sure that midwife is supported and can operate well. UNFPA has got a new midwifery strategy, and it's going to take us through to 2030, and it's a really solid guide for countries to advance midwifery as a profession, but also women's health and their sexual and reproductive health and rights.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. We'll come back to that, but moving on to you, Sathya. You are at the Population Fund's Bangladesh office. It's a country that's known in the last few years, especially for its midwives and the professionalizing of the work that they do. So could you document what's changed in Bangladesh over the years, and perhaps using that as a wider canvas as to what's changed from your perspective?
Sure, Roy. Bangladesh, as you know, got its independence in 1971. At the time of its independence, Bangladesh was a country which was ravaged by war and a country which was taken up with very poor socioeconomic indicators. Over the last 4.5 decades, the country has made enormous strides on the economic front into a major economic force in the region. And basically, they've been able to do that by investing a lot in education and in women empowerment in general. So today, as we speak, the big economic driver of the country is its garment industry, with 80% of the workforce being girls and women. So the girls and women, the recognition and the empowerment that has happened with women and girls has been a significant reason for its progress. So this is at the larger economic front. You go on a little bit in terms of the empowerment that I just talked about in terms of women and girls. Also in terms of the investment in education, you see the enrollment ratio for boys and girls have equaled even at the secondary level. So, and they continue to invest in girls' education. And zooming in a little bit more into ICPD and what has happened is that the country started off with an approach of being a highly densely populated country, a small country in geographic size, but in terms of population, a big population. So therefore, immediately after the independence, there was a lot of political commitment to scale up family planning program. So it started more like a population control program, which services made available, but at this all the time they kind of kept it rights-based, but there was a big effort to scale up family planning services. But come the ICPD, they kind of moved away from that approach because the gains were not as much in family planning as they had at the height or at the time of independence. So they moved into this constellation of services, which is not just family planning services, a vertical model they understood will not work. So it went into a comprehensive clinics for women and girls' needs on sexual reproductive health. So that constellation of services started in the 90s and it still continues. But if you really see very closely, in the last 6 or 7 years, there's been a plateauing of several indicators, both on maternal mortality as well as family planning and unmet need. So the country now realizes it's not about just access, it's not about quantity anymore, it's about quality. So the quality can be defined in multiple dimensions, but the key is quality human resource. So it really understands that the midwives are the ones that can bring in the quality services for women and girls, and it's not just about providing delivery services and maternity services, but comprehensive sexual reproductive health care. So there is not one class of a provider who can provide the full spectrum of sexual reproductive health in a compassionate and in a friendly manner to women and girls in particular. So lots of change has happened, and more recently, introduction of the midwifery profession is a huge shot in the arm for the country.
In a way, segueing from that to you, Rondi, you've been a practicing midwife for the last 40 years or so. So, especially over the last 20, 25 years under the ICPD Programme of Action, from your perspective, what's changed?
It's interesting to think about it, just going over what's happened in high-resource countries and what's happened in low-resource countries where I've worked. Just quickly, in terms of the high-resource countries, I think that that what's been most profound is this evidence-based routine care. That when I started as a midwife almost 40 years ago, we knew, like Carolyn was saying, we knew in our hearts that babies should be skin to skin, that women should be upright, they should move around, that they should be empowered and follow their instincts, that different positions should happen, that support people should be with them. And we fought for it, even though we didn't have the evidence. And it's just been very cool that in the last few years, it's all WHO guidelines. It's quality of care standards. And so now, my friends that are still practicing in high-resource countries are writing to me and saying, Rondi, at the North Shore Medical Center of Boston, we're now doing skin-to-skin for an hour. And when I left, that wasn't happening. So that's high-resource countries. But the first low-resource country I went to was Somalia. And I mean, Somalia had the strongest, most tenacious women manning these shacks that we called hospitals that had no resources except what the NGO that I was working for brought in. And people would come and they would be sicker than anybody that I'd ever seen in an ICU in the United States, and they would get to work and take care of them. But there were huge gaps. These women were not midwives. They were very minimally prepared. They didn't understand about evidence-based routine care. There was many things about emergency management they didn't know. Comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care, huge gaps in that. And so in the other countries where I've worked, that has slowly, those pieces are coming together. And I could see it a little bit more in Sierra Leone, where there were some midwives, and we did have an STI clinic, and HIV was starting to be treated, and we knew how to manage, like magnesium sulfate was given immediately. And then in Rwanda was the first place where I worked with ICM standard midwives and education, and there the new midwives were coming in, and the maternity floors were starting to be, you would see, even though you were sort of in a transition period, so you've got women supine lined up next to each other, but then the baby is skin to skin, or occasionally the woman gets up and squats. And when somebody comes in with an emergency, the midwives know what to do. They've got it like a drill. And the day that I arrived in Bangladesh 4 years ago, almost to the day, a few days later I went to this, the IDM, the International Day of the Midwives, and you just saw, I mean, there probably weren't thousands, but at least 500 midwives all together. And it felt, I mean, I just remember feeling like my heart swell, like this empowerment of women, like as the status of women rises, then midwives, the status of midwives rises, and they go together, and it just felt like such a profound statement to me. But that was 2015, and the midwives would graduate at the end of that year. And as I started visiting facilities in Bangladesh, many pieces were in place. And there was a maternity unit, but the table was flat, and there was no emergencies coming into the peripheral facilities, the district, the sub-district hospitals and union hospitals. They weren't managing postpartum hemorrhage and eclampsia. The women were alone in labor, and the VIA corner, although they knew that there should be one, there wasn't. It was empty. You didn't see anybody there. And just last week, I was in the field visiting. I visited 6 facilities last week, and it was just so heartening. I mean, the midwives are now there. They feel empowered. They're proud to tell me the work that they're doing. We've established a separate ANC corner. These are all the things that we're doing, and they bring me up to the maternity wards and show the women up. They've now all got squatting chairs and balls, and the women all have companions with them. And if I ask them, what do you do about if a postpartum hemorrhage comes, they list it to me. We do this, and we do this, and we bring her up here, and we do this. Mm-hmm. And it feels amazing to me. It feels amazing in 4 years that just by deploying these, now we have 1,200 midwives at 350 sub-district hospitals, that it's tangible. You can see it. Mm-hmm.
You just spoke about the compassionate attitude and the understanding, but Caroline, would it be fair to say that, but that's not always the case with midwives. We've actually heard stories where they're not so compassionate, where they need more of a bedside manner. So how do you bring that about?
Yeah, I guess the disrespect and abuse that we see, particularly in labour, but also in the whole spectrum of care for women, has always shocked and astonished me. I can't understand how it can be that we can be so disrespectful to women. But I think it comes from many, many underlying reasons, and one is the disempowerment of midwives and the disempowerment of midwives in their role. And so that's one of the really important strategies, is to value midwives, to value midwifery, to ensure that midwives are looked after and supported so that if you're cared for, you can better care for other people. The respectful care movement, which is the last 5 to 10 years across the world, has made huge advances, I think, in firstly labelling this issue as being important. So disrespect and abuse is the common title, and we can now see it and say it, and we know how to define it. And then what to do about it, which is this whole respectful care movement. And it's really heartening to see it in guidelines. As Rondi said, we're now seeing the things that we know instinctively in our heart is important is now in guidelines, WHO guidelines, the most recent intrapartum care guidelines, for example. It also then feeds into a whole lot of other strategies. So companionship in labour. It's much harder to be disrespectful to a woman if her companion's standing next to her. Mm-hmm. Midwives are much more likely, all maternity care providers I feel are much more likely to behave kindly and well. We've paid a big emphasis in midwifery education on respectful care and on kindness in care. And while the technical skills are critical, so you need to know how to fix a postpartum hemorrhage, you need to know how to support a woman giving birth and putting a drip in and a cannula and a catheter and all those things, but actually you also need to learn how to be kind. And one of the training I do in some countries, particularly across the Pacific, the first thing we say is when a woman comes in labour, you smile at her and you're nice to her and you're kind to her, because that slows everything down in terms of the anxiety that everybody's feeling. So we lower the adrenaline, we higher the oxytocin levels, and that makes for a better environment for everybody. It's not easy when you work in a labour ward with 24 beds and 40 women in labour and maybe 5 midwives. You can do the maths. It's not an easy place to work in, and that's the reality in many places around the world. But small things make a difference, and I really think kindness and respectful care are small things that we can actually all do without too much training.
So just picking up on something you said, it's about the empowerment of the midwives themselves, that the compassionate attitude comes as they get more empowered, as they feel more worthwhile. So from a policy perspective, as someone who's actually worked on these issues, what can you share about that?
Okay, I just wanted to pick up also on something that Caroline was saying in terms of respectful care. I think that also one thing we've seen since ICPD is the recognition, of women's rights and women's rights to, to equality, gender equality, and women's empowerment, and for women to be able to be treated with respect when they are, in labour and receiving health care. So I think this is something also in terms of we're seeing improvements, although slow, in terms of women's status in countries and in societies. But I need you to ask me the question again, Roy.
Yes, the question is that, as we see the status of midwives improve and we see policies being implemented, from your perspective as someone who's been advising countries on policy, what are the challenges in getting midwifery to be, shall we say, taken more seriously, to be actually elevated into a profession rather than something that's seen as a perhaps not as important adjunct?
So I think there's many challenges that countries have faced in terms of health system strengthening, and one of the key parts of strengthening health systems is the human resources. And I think to a large extent, a lot of the emphasis in the beginning was on doctors, and looking at coverage of doctors being able to perform a lot of that care. And midwifery and nursing, frankly, it was they're women's professions also, and they were also less valued. So getting recognition for professions that are taking care of women's health and professions that have women who are in those professions, it's a doubly hard task. But I think that the countries have recognised, and as Caroline said, the Lancet series and a number of pieces of research have actually shown countries that if you invest in midwifery, this workforce can actually help you deliver all of these key sexual and reproductive health services at a very good, reasonable cost. So you have strong return, on investment from investing in midwives. I think that what we've been able to do is to show this. We've needed to work at and show countries about these economic investments, right? The costs that are involved, but also on the returns that they will see.
I know that you were in Cambodia for a while, and this was one of the issues that you were personally involved with and working with the government. So can you share something about the Cambodian experience? Because we've been featuring quite a few stories about their program over the past couple of years.
Sure. Yeah, I think for a country like Cambodia that had been through a civil war, the very first priority for Cambodia in rebuilding the health system was to build the structures of the health facilities and then to quickly put in place the health personnel. They had a total destruction of their health workforce of doctors, nurses and midwives. So UNFPA picked this up very, very early on, and we had short, medium and long-term strategies. In the short term, we had very quickly trained, skilled attendants put in these health facilities. But we knew that was not that those people, those midwives, were not going to be able to deal with any complicated cases, and we were only just touching the tip of the iceberg. So UNFPA Cambodia really worked on developing medium and longer term strategies, and what we've been able to do in Cambodia is to have midwifery recognised as an important profession. We have been able to get the country to train midwives according to ICM standards. So for the first time ever, we now have curriculums that are training midwives according to ICM standards. We have challenges with faculty because in order to teach midwives, you also need to have the experience both as a midwife but also as a teacher. And UNFPA has been supporting Cambodia in building the capacity of the faculty. And in addition to that, we've been working on the actual workforce to try to help Cambodia and the Ministry of Health to identify where they need to place more midwives and the attention that they need to pay to recruiting, deploying and retaining midwives in some of the most remote parts of the country where we don't have health workers, or we have a lone single health worker. We've also placed priority on the association, and then now more than ever we're also looking at quality and at regulation of both the profession but also of the educational institutions that are training the midwives.
Sathya, as we just heard from Catherine, working with government, convincing them to invest in midwives, into SRH, what was the investment case that UNFPA made vis-a-vis the government when it came to strengthening the profession?
Right. So with respect to midwifery, and I might have kind of highlighted a little bit in my earlier response, because at least since 2010, Bangladesh's indicators have more or less plateaued. So came a point in 2010, the trend was already clearly suggestive that the progression is not in the right direction. So therefore, the country was at a point where it had to do three things with its health sector investment. One, it had to focus on equity to reach populations that were left behind, the most marginalized communities, the most hard to reach populations. And secondly, it needed to focus on quality. And thirdly, it needed to become efficient. So, and therefore the investment had to bring better returns. So there was also a lot of emerging data, and also the State of the Midwifery report came subsequently a few years down the line, which clearly showed that the midwives bring a big return on their investment. Some estimates are up to 16-fold return for an investment in midwifery. And also the fact that the midwives were coming with a lot of enthusiasm and motivation, were willing to work in remote locations where the other cadres were not willing to go. And also the fact that they provided quality standards. It's one profession where there is an international standard of International Confederation of Midwives. The curriculum was designed in such a way that they were competent to meet all the ICM standards. So basically one professional was able to kind of look at all the three components of both equity component and equity, quality and efficiency. And therefore, it was a good, right moment, and the fact that we were strengthening the comprehensive sexual reproductive health services. Again, this is one cadre who could not just help improve the indicators around maternal mortality, but could make a big difference in terms of family planning, which was also plateauing, who could also kind of make a dent in cervical cancer, was an emerging issue in terms of pre-screening, in terms of the gender-based violence and providing a quality response to survivors of gender-based violence, and also in terms of being adolescent friendly. So what we talk about in terms of comprehensive sexual reproductive health, there was one cadre who could actually provide it. So when the government bought into this clear evidence-based argument and arrangement, so then UNFPA supported at the initial stages with WHO, focused on 4 pillars of support. So this was very customized to Bangladesh, the approach. One being on setting the regulatory framework and bringing in the licensing and the accreditation components. The second pillar was around strengthening the education, the midwifery education. The third pillar was in terms of practice, helping or supporting the midwives to integrate within the health system to be able to deliver services. And the fourth pillar being advocacy and awareness. So that we needed to attract future generation, future adolescent girls to be able to take up the profession of midwifery. So we took a 4-pillar approach with the government of Bangladesh and to advance it. And we've come a long way from there.
Sathya, of course, you've worked quite extensively in the humanitarian field. I have seen your CV and you've done so much work in that. And of course, that's also a big part of the midwifery interventions in Bangladesh with the ongoing Rohingya crisis. Rondi, for the last couple of years especially, you've been working a lot in Cox's Bazar with the Rohingya crisis and with midwives over there. So what's been your experience in that horrible crisis scenario?
We just had 1,000 midwives graduate from a midwifery educational program and they were licensed. So it was a really good opportunity for a nexus between our preparation in the development context, making us also ready to respond in a humanitarian context. And it just coincidentally, it turned out that where the refugees came in is also a part of the country that's hit by cyclones. So before we were responding, we were responding at a very low grade level to the refugees because they've been there for a long time, but in much, much smaller numbers. We had cyclones that came and we sent in these young diploma midwives. We gave them our rapid response team training, which gave them some sense of this minimal initial service package that we give in RH settings. And we sent them 2 by 2 into these remote health facilities that had been affected by cyclones, and we gave them kits that gave them the life-saving commodities that they needed. And we put them on a Facebook page so that they would communicate with us, and we prayed And they did fantastic. They just thrived. I mean, they went out into the communities, they told them that they were there, they opened doors of facilities that weren't open, and they strengthened the ones that were open. Their numbers climbed immediately. They sent us lots of messages about really extraordinary experiences that they had. So we were, and it just coincidentally happens to be that that is the same neighborhood as where the refugees came in. So, and we had a small refugee influx before the more recent 700,000 or 800,000 came in at only 80,000. And in that influx, we had already started strengthening the government facilities that were around where the refugees live. So we were offering services both to host and the refugees through these midwives. So we had started to do the same thing we'd done in the cyclones, putting them near the refugees, and already we're having successes of people coming. So when the 750,000 new arrivals came, the dramatic element was just that there were so many of them, and we had to scale up so quickly so that we were sending in, I mean, literally a couple hundred midwives went in to facilities that were both the government facilities surrounding, but also within the camps. And structures were going up, and we were having to set up systems of how the midwives would come and go and where would they stay. And of course, in that minimum initial service package, one of the most critical things that you do is respond to emergencies. So how do we get it 24/7? And what if the woman comes in with a postpartum hemorrhage? How does the midwife get her out? And where does she go? Because as facilities are popping up so quickly, but they have variable degrees of function. So getting all of those systems established in a city the size of Baltimore that just popped up was really a big challenge. But luckily, the sincerity of the midwives is, I mean, it's really heartening that I think that there's really been global attention on these midwives, that they've really led this part of Asia. And as many of them as there are, they feel it, they know it, they are proud of it. They know that their mission is to take care of mothers. So they went in and they made us proud. I mean, we've got pictures of them holding umbrellas, walking through mud, and doing what they needed to do.
So the Cox's Bazar context is one that was born out of conflict. But in the Pacific, where you've, of course, focused so many years as well, we have so many natural disasters, cyclones and storms of all kinds and volcanoes. And how far have they come in their midwifery services in the humanitarian sphere? And more widely speaking, what have been the challenges there? How far have they come in the last 25 years under the ICPD Programme of Action?
So the Pacific's a really interesting area. It's there's 14 very small island nations, and then Papua New Guinea, which is the largest, with the largest population. But some of those island nations have 1 or 2 midwives to cope with the population that they've got. They may only have 10 or 20 births a year, but that's still 10 or 20 births that need to be accommodated. Many of the countries have had to send their people out to do their training, so whether it's midwifery, nursing or medicine, and some of them don't come back. So the migration drain has been a big challenge across the Pacific. I think those countries cope with, as you say, the natural disasters, so cyclones, floods, increasingly climate change. They're island atolls and the roads go around the outside, and as the sea level starts going up, those roads are now being washed away. So small island nations that had very good transport systems are really struggling into the next 10 years, I think. And so, it's heartening that climate change is one of the SDGs, showing the importance of climate change, and in that region it's particularly difficult. UNFPA have just led a analysis of the workforce for sexual, reproductive, maternal health across the Pacific, which has just been released, and that's showing, it's very interesting because small countries look like they've got a high net need of services, but actually you take one midwife out of the mix and they go down to being almost nothing. And a country like Papua New Guinea, which is 8 or 9 million people, it's an hour north of Australia with very difficult conditions in terms of geography. They've got a very big need in workforce. They only have about 25% of the workforce they need, and an enormous investment is going to need to happen in the next 10 to 20 years to actually shift that, to bring their maternal mortality ratio and newborn mortality ratio down. So there's some really challenging countries across the Pacific. The midwives are often not counted. They're included in nursing, so they're sort of invisible. So I think the work we've been doing lately has been trying to make midwifery visible, and in a challenging context. So fantastic countries to work in. I'm very fortunate to work with the people of the Pacific. They sing beautiful songs, and they have an incredible enthusiasm for life, even with a whole lot of challenges around them.
So we're running out of time, but I'd like to end the panel with a final question and final thoughts, including personal stories. So Catherine, I know that you are helping put in place roadmaps to end preventable maternal deaths across Asia and the Pacific. Can you spell out what these roadmaps are, what they really intend to do, how will they unfold? And also, can you share one personal experience from your own life, from your own work, that actually brings home the importance of this work to you?
So the workshop is aimed at helping us as a region and 12 of the countries in the region with the highest burden of maternal mortality to map out a path for us to end preventable maternal deaths. So there are and I put the emphasis on the preventable maternal deaths. Each country is going to have analysed what are the main causes of these of the preventable maternal deaths. What is it that we need to do to improve the situation, and what specifically is UNFPA's role within this? What is our comparative advantage, and where is it that UNFPA can accelerate progress? It'll also help us identify opportunities for South-South collaboration, so between countries, because different countries have different experiences, and some have achieved MDG goals, so they've got a lot to share. So we hope we'll also be able to identify opportunities for that collaboration.
And a personal story from your experience that you'd like to leave the audience with?
I think one of the things that, as a very young person, when I had finished studying nursing, and I felt that the hospital in Sydney, it wasn't the place, for me. And I bought a ticket and I went to India. And I had to do some volunteer work. And I have two experiences and images that really have propelled me in this work. The first one was in Howrah Station in Calcutta. I was basically on my way to catch a train to Himachal Pradesh, where I was going to work up with the Tibetan refugees. And in that station, on my way to Howrah Station, I was in a taxi and the taxi broke down, and I had to run out of the taxi down to Howrah Station to get my train before it left. And on Howrah Station, I ran past a woman who had miscarried a very young fetus, and she was on the station alone, crying, and the fetus was there, and she was crying and sobbing, and I was thinking, oh my God, here is this woman and there is my train and I'm about to miss the train. I got on the train and I cried for 20 hours because the train was late. But I had this feeling of, why didn't I do something? But at the same time, I knew that actually I couldn't have helped her. When I arrived up in the Tibetan refugee camps, I was working in a small health centre up there, and there was a woman who came one night. I heard stones being thrown on my window, saying, please, my wife is in labour, can you please help her? And I was really, really afraid, because I had finished my study as a nurse, not as a midwife, and I was alone, and I was really afraid. And I opened the door and she came in with a traditional birth attendant. And the traditional birth attendant had done all that she could, but you know, the woman was still hadn't delivered the baby. We delivered the baby, and the baby wasn't breathing, and I resuscitated that baby, and the baby lived, and it was an incredible experience. And the Tibetan woman thought it was, the Lama had told her that everything will be all right, that it's safe to deliver in that facility. You know, you don't need to go into the main facility. Everything will be okay. But what it really left me with this passion for maternal health and for midwifery, and I never returned to do my actual midwifery, which was what I always wanted to do, but I started in public health and really in advocating for midwifery and for maternal health and the care that women really deserve and need.
Wow, wonderful stories, Catherine.
Yes, I have others, but
Sathya, any thoughts and a story from you or an experience you'd like to share?
Yes, Roy. Of course, there are many experiences from various settings, but I would choose something that's more recent and in Bangladesh and with midwives. So I kind of work at a programming level and more at a policy advocacy level. So creating a new profession in a country is not that easy, as you would imagine. Even though there may be goodwill, there are several actors, stakeholders who are the protagonists, some are the antagonists, and you also have a lot of administrative issues that you have to kind of maneuver. So when we invested in midwifery education and work with the government, so we used to go to the midwifery schools just to encourage the midwives and to see how the education is delivered and so on. So that process, the midwives are very young, and then they are social media friendly, and then they kind of network with you on social media. So you keep the contacts. So what happened recently was of course the first deployment of midwives in Bangladesh happened late 2015, early 2016. But these were nurse midwives who were kind of redeployed as midwives after their training. But the younger ones, the direct entry midwives, were already graduated in 2016 and 2017. But there were a lot of issues that we had to kind of maneuver before they could be officially deployed in the health facilities. So, for example, they had to go through a Public Service Commission exam, which has never been created before. First time they had to do it for the midwives. And the facilities, the managers had to receive them to know who the midwife is. There were several steps that we needed to do. But to break one barrier after the other and just get the system, move around it. And then when the midwives finally landed up in the facilities, the first deployment happened in 2017. And they came and these midwives who were networked with us, they said, they generally called sir, being the polite and modest they are. They say, we are now deployed in this particular facility, and today I conducted a delivery, and in this facility in the last 3 years there has been no delivery at all. So the fact that the kind of systems that you had to maneuver, the pain that you had to go through, and all the effort was worth it when the midwife tells you, I've made a difference. And that's exactly what we are working for. And at that moment, I'm so proud to be working for UNFPA and have contributed to this profession development in the country. Yeah.
Thank you, Sathya. Rondi.
I guess the story that I will tell is my first introduction to low-resource birth in low-resource settings. At that point, I had been working as a midwife for about 20 years, and I had been 10 years in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania with the Amish. So I was in a situation where I was doing home births with kerosene light, and what was before cell phones, so we were talking on two-way radios if we had to call for an ambulance. And I delivered a couple thousand babies in that setting. And from there I went to Somalia. And when I got on a plane, I thought, I've seen everything. There's nothing new. I mean, I know how to handle birth. And walking into that hospital in Somalia, I was introduced to a level of suffering that was unimaginable to me. And I mean, the cases that come into my head that I remember, like the placenta had been in for a month and the one leg was necrotic. And people with cerebral malaria that weren't getting the treatment that they needed, and people with antepartum bleeding where she'd been bleeding for days and she was anemic and she was going to die really soon, and we had to convince the doctors to come in and do a cesarean section. And people coming from home births where there would be a leg out and an arm out, and they'd been pounding on her traditional attendants had been pounding on her so her uterus was ruptured, and even shoulder dystocias where you've got the head out and it's been out for 24 hours and the baby has died and it's starting to macerate, but there's nobody that that knows how to get the baby the rest of the way out. That it just felt so poignant, it felt like such a strong cry from women that this is urgent, that we have to prioritize this. And I was just, I mean, that was 1999. And Deborah Main had started to publish, and I started to read the public health literature about how, you know, it was before EMONC, but we were starting to understand that we needed emergency response, that all women needed to have access to emergency response. And we hadn't even started to think about how do we get respect and how do we do evidence-based care. When a baby was born in Somalia stillbirth, nobody cried. It was like this, the degree of suffering, it was like grieving was a privilege, that they had lost so much that it didn't even blip their radar screen. So I just felt like if I was going to do something with my life, that if I could use my midwifery skills to help this situation, it felt meaningful.
So we'll end where we started with you, Caroline, for some closing remarks and some shared experience.
I guess my closing remark is sort of my experience, and I went as a very baby midwife to Malawi in Africa a long time ago, and was taught by the midwives in Malawi how to be a midwife, and I'm incredibly grateful for that experience. It was also the first time I saw a woman die in labour. And a little bit like Rondi, sort of galvanised me to think there has to be a better way to do this. But my experience that is recent, which I want to share, is we've been working in Papua New Guinea with the Papua New Guinea Midwives and the Midwifery Association there and UNFPA and WHO for the last 10 years. And in the last 7 or 8 years, we've been working to build midwifery education again. They'd kind of stopped midwifery education in a proper way for a long time and got down to, I think, 100 midwives in the country, but not very well registered or licensed. And so there was a big project that I was privileged enough to lead with bringing in mentor midwives into the schools to rebuild the midwifery education. And this was an enormously challenging activity with lots of protagonists and antagonists and people who wanted it to happen and didn't want it to happen, but mostly a lot of commitment that this needed to work. And we started supporting midwifery education. And a year or so ago, I met one of those early graduates, and she came from a very rural area. Papua New Guinea is 80% of the people live in very rural settings. Sometimes you walk for 2 days to get to a facility. And she worked in one of these facilities, a little health centre, really in the middle of a rural area. And the years before she did her midwifery education, she was a nurse, and she had told me of all the women she'd seen die. So women had come to the health centre bleeding, with twins, with eclampsia, and she said, I never knew what to do. And mostly I hid because I didn't know what to do, or I sent them away and I heard that they died on the way. And she said, once I did midwifery education and I got my facility sorted out and I got the oxytocin and I knew what to do, she hadn't had a maternal death since she'd been back in that facility. And she was so proud that she'd made such a difference to her community and was so committed to moving forward. And it really showed me the strength of midwifery education, of good regulation, of good support, of the enabling environment, and looking after the workforce. So and recognising the midwife. And they're the 6 key elements in the new midwifery strategy for UNFPA. So I really think that, you know, we've come a long way. We've still got a long way to go. And I just want to end by saying this is still unfinished business. We have not got to 0 preventable maternal mortality in actually any of our countries, but particularly in low resource countries. So we mustn't drop the ball. This is not hard to fix. It's challenging to fix, but we know how to do it. So I look forward to, I'm not sure about the next 25 years, but a bit of time to keep going, to keep fighting this battle.
Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for a wonderful conversation. I have personally learned so much in this last 45 minutes or so. As we talk about ICPD at 25, lessons learned and the road ahead with the special focus on midwives. And we will, of course, mark the International Day of the Midwife on May the 5th. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.